Greetings, philosophers! Hello, welcome back. It's been a while. For many of us, I know it's... I'm trying to think of the last time I streamed. I guess it was maybe like a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago. I've been taking a bit of a break recently, but starting to get back into it. In that break, I don't know if anybody saw my post on YouTube for why, but really there were two main reasons. One of them was Silksong, and the other, which I told myself I would try to work on more, was editing a video that's coming up on knowledge and the nature of knowledge. I will admit I haven't been editing that video as much as I'd like, but I have made some good progress on it and might be able to release it this week. We'll see. But really those two things have been kind of taking up most of my time. And I see all of you here in the chat saying hello. Thank you. So yeah, Tia Fair, Estella, Epa, Terraditto. Good to see all of you again. So I hope I didn't worry anybody with my little break there. If you did, if you missed me too much, I am sorry. But now I'm going to be getting back into streaming a little bit more. Yeah, it's one of the things I'm still trying to think about, like the best way to go about taking breaks as a streamer. Like I've heard different things on this, and I'm still not sure what my approach will be. Every once in a while, it is nice to kind of, you know, get away from things for a while, just kind of take a few days to yourself. I guess one good thing is that even if you take a break for a few days, you can always know, like, there are lots of other streamers out there. So hopefully, whoever you are as a streamer, your audience will not be like, oh, there's no one to watch. But in any case, thank you all for sticking with me. It's really you all that brought me back most of all, because just getting to interact with you all, I think that's the most rewarding part of streaming. Also, speaking of new streaming things, I recently got a new microphone, and I hope it sounds okay. This is my first time using it in a stream, and so if my voice is either too loud or, you know, if it's not loud enough, let me know and I can adjust it. I think one difficulty that I had sort of initially as a streamer is that I have a naturally pretty soft voice, and so sometimes it can be a little tough for my voice to come out kind of strongly with the microphone. But I did some research and was looking for ones that looked like they would sound good with my voice, and I think I found one that works pretty well. Stella says W mic. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear it's a W mic. But yeah, today's been a pretty good day for me so far. I took a nap earlier, which is always nice, and went to get some groceries, and now I'm feeling ready for some Friday night philosophy of religion. So I don't know if you are feeling ready, but I am. And in fact, in just a moment, I'll be going into some of my background, because this might sound a little surprising, given that I haven't done much philosophy of religion content on this channel so far, but philosophy of religion, in a way, was one of the things that first got me into philosophy. Like when I look back on my philosophical influences, and a question that is always an interesting question, I think, to ask a philosopher: how did you get into philosophy? For me, the answer is largely philosophy of religion. So I'll be saying a little bit more about all of that. You'll be going into my IRL lore for that part of the stream. See, Tia Ferris says many streamers always take the same days of the week off. It's predictable that way. Yeah, I might like it to go into that eventually. Have something like that, like a regular schedule. Problem is, I've just never been like a good person for having regular schedules in general. Like my sleep schedule is like always random. It's always all over the place. I should probably work on that. So for right now, I'm just kind of like streaming, like, you know, whatever days or whatever times I'll be awake. But maybe I should have a sleeping stream at some point. That could be fun. Estella's super interested in this topic. Oh, glad to hear it. Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic. So here's a little bit about my background before we go into more of the philosophy. When I was growing up, and in particular from about 4th grade, actually I was from exactly 4th grade, until the end of high school, I went to a religious school, a parochial school. It was affiliated with the Church of Christ, which for those who don't know is one of the kind of stricter denominations of Protestantism. And so, for example, with the Church of Christ, during worship, there's no musical instruments. It's all just, singing a cappella. There's also no dancing, at least like during, official, church-related events and things like that. It's like we didn't have a prom at my school. Like we had what we called a banquet as a kind of a replacement for prom. And there were some things like that were a little bit unusual. Like we had chapel every day, and we had, Bible classes and classes like that. And for most of my time there, like early on especially, I didn't really think about it too much. It was just kind of like a thing that we did, like, oh, okay, like it's time for chapel, or like, oh, okay, like it's time for Bible class. I'll get to learn about the Bible. As I was going into high school, though, I started to think about it more. And one of the, I guess, moments or elements that really made me start thinking about it more was this element of belief in hell, and the thought that people who did not have the right religious view, like in that case, people who were not Christians, would suffer in hell for eternity. And I found that, what's the best word? Like, I was disturbed by that prospect, but also just something about the belief seemed to me as if it couldn't be true. As if for a God to be good, he wouldn't institute an afterlife scheme like that. And so as I was thinking about it, I sort of came to feel that that was a pretty good objection, at least to the version of Christianity that my peers embraced. I later came to learn there are versions of Christianity that don't embrace the idea of hell, or at least not an eternal hell. But for my peers and my teachers at the time, that was a big part of the belief system for them. And so as I sort of came to think about this more and talk about it, and that was one of the things that kind of made me interested in the question of like, oh, okay, is Christianity true? Is there a way it might overcome this objection? Like, what do Christians say about this? And so I got into more discussions with my peers and my teachers about it, and I sort of came to sort of research more about the philosophy of religion. And as I went through that process, I sort of became an atheist. I see Jesus Christ in the chat saying I was a good moral teacher. I didn't expect Jesus himself to show up in the chat. Welcome, Jesus. Yeah, that's wow. We have a special guest here today. And Tia Fair says, well, I guess dancing the devil's pastime. See, I should warn you, Jesus, we're talking about some things here that might be a little scandalizing. Like I brought up dancing earlier. But anyway, yeah, as I was sort of thinking about all this stuff more as a kid, as a high school student, and talking about it with my peers more, I've really sort of started to think about philosophy of religion more deeply. Because very often, like, and it wasn't just hell, like there were, other elements that as I came to learn about, I came to think like, oh, this is an interesting objection. Like, what do Christians say about this? I often found it kind of tricky to articulate the reasons why I felt kind of unsure or kind of skeptical toward the faith. And that was an interesting challenge to me, an interesting motivation to try to learn, like, okay, I might feel not, very confident about this, or not very good, or not, I might feel that it's not very plausible, but like, why? Why do I really not, believe this? What's the real source of the objection, or the multiple objections, as it were? And so that was an interesting motivation for me to kind of hone my philosophical abilities, to try to see, like, okay, why, like, do I have this intuitive sense that at least this particular version of the religion is false? Like, what's really sort of driving my thoughts? And that's kind of how I became a philosopher, essentially. I was not necessarily reading like good, material. A lot of it was just kind of material that was in the popular consciousness at the time. So a lot of this was like new atheist stuff, people like, Richard Dawkins and so on, Christopher Hitchens. So people who were not like really philosophers, but like for me and many others, like encountering their writings was sort of one of the first exposures that we had to, certain philosophical questions. And I do have to give credit where credit is due. Even while I was at one point going through my sort of feisty atheist phase, the peers and teachers at my school always accepted me. I was the only atheist in the school, a bit of a nonconformist in that way. And I was open about how I felt, but like my peers were still friends with me. Like they did not ostracize me over it. And my teachers were still nice to me. And they did not, fail me when I when I like argued in my papers that that their religion was false, or when I, engaged them in like debates in my Bible class and brought up, lots of objections. They, let me have my say. And that's something that I've tried to sort of keep in mind as an example in my own sort of teaching in, future years when I went on to become a teacher and professor and so on. I've always tried to make lots of space for constructive disagreement. And I think part of that, I don't know if it's, I might have gone to do that anyway. I hope I would have, but I do like to think that sort of the first really solid example that I had of that way of handling disagreements was through my teachers and my peers at that school. So yeah, that's some of my IRL philosophy lore. I wouldn't say that I do a lot of philosophy of religion these days, at least not like as sort of the philosophy that I dive into the deepest. But I still do think about it quite a bit, and this is just partly because of, it's a topic that I think when it comes to non-philosophers or just people in general, it's one of the topics that maybe is sort of closest to philosophy that they might regularly think about. And I find it always leads to interesting conversations. It's like sometimes I'll still write, Substack posts that are about philosophy of religion in some way. Tia Fair says, only one, and you were open about it. Yeah, pretty much. Bro, I'm so proud of you. You went through Bible school and Richard Dawkins and still turned out a free thinker. Yeah, I have had a lot of influences on my development, and they were certainly some of the key ones. But yeah, it's a question I've always wondered, like, why did I turn out this way and not just, go along with whatever was taught? And I don't know if I'll ever have the answer to that. I think I've just always had that kind of philosopher's sort of skeptical, inquiring spirit. But with that in mind, I think now we should be ready to dive in more deeply. So this will be reading 3 Substack posts, this stream, 3 Substack posts that I did, which I was originally going to post as just kind of 2 Substack posts, or maybe even 1, but eventually ended up getting long enough to where I posted them as 3 separate posts. And these will be on the moral teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Because I think that even though it's true that Jesus was not a philosopher, he was certainly a moral teacher, put forth various moral precepts, moral principles that have been, I think it's fair to say, so influential that he counts as the most significant moral teacher in history. And so my motivation for considering this question and for writing these posts was, well, okay, philosophers might tend not to like engage directly with the words of Jesus themselves, but what would or what could a philosopher say about this? Like, what might these teachings, how might they stand up when we subject them to philosophical scrutiny? And so I have a series of posts here, again, just a short series. I'm going to post a link to the first one in the chat now. And so that way, if anybody wants to follow along what I'm reading, you can have it on hand. The first post in the series will be about elements of Jesus' moral teaching that I believe are positive, that I think that Jesus got right. So the moral principles that I find to be the most plausible or the most insightful that he put forth. And then the other two posts will be on areas of disagreement. So ways that I think that Jesus could have gone better in his moral teaching. And some of these were sort of objections or motivations that came to me as a high school student, things that kind of initially sort of turned me in the direction of sort of going atheist, and then others are sort of more recent. But again, first we'll be looking into the parts of his philosophy that I think were on the right track. Someone's mowing the lawn outside and it's so hard to hear you. Oh no. Yeah, those damn lawnmowers. Hate it when that happens. So there's the link to the first post. Why don't we go ahead and go over to my screen here. Yep, there we go. Oh, it looks like I need to maybe change my position here. Okay, yeah, that's probably a little bit better. Oh wait, now that's OBS. Sorry, y'all don't want to see OBS. At least I take it, unless you're interested in like, hey, here's the kind of behind the scenes look. So again, the title of this post is How Good a Moral Teacher Was Jesus? This is just part one. Oh, I might still be a little bit large, so it's hard for me to see VTube Studio and OBS kind of on the screen all at once. Maybe I'll just kind of put myself down here. And that should solve the issue. I think I should be small enough now to where people can sort of see the text, see what I'm reading. This first post is not very long. It should not take very long to read. After I read it, I'm just going to pause and we can talk about it, can chat. You all can bring up any thoughts or objections. And then I'll look at some of the other posts that go into my objections to Jesus' moral teaching. Introduction. Of all the moral teachers who have lived, plausibly the most influential is Jesus of Nazareth. His impact is reflected not simply in how Christianity has become the world's dominant religion. Beyond this, his principles have been found to be a perennial source of moral wisdom, even among countless non-Christians. And yet, for all Jesus' world-shaping influence in the moral sphere, it's rare, in my experience, to see moral philosophers engage with his words directly. On one level, it's understandable that moral philosophers would tend to direct their attention elsewhere, as Jesus wasn't a moral philosopher. He was more in the business of making pronouncements than offering arguments. Still, while not a moral philosopher, Jesus was unquestionably a moral teacher, someone who proposed various moral rules and commandments. And in light of the wisdom and force that so many have felt his moral guidance to hold, a worthwhile question to consider, regardless of whether one is oneself a Christian, is how good a moral teacher Jesus ultimately was. In this series of posts, then, I intend to examine and evaluate Jesus' moral teachings. This exploration will eventually include, in part 2, discussing some aspects of his moral teaching that I find objectionable. Here, though, in part 1, I'd like to focus on what I believe to be the most commendable moral teachings Jesus offered. Jesus' moral teachings, the good, favoring compassion over arbitrary religious rituals and customs. The moral picture of Jesus that emerges in the Gospels is of someone who cares less about following the blind dictates of ancient custom than about helping the suffering. On one occasion, Mark 3, 1-6, for instance, Jesus heals a man's hand and, in so doing, flouts the Pharisees' injunction not to work on the Sabbath. Quote, "And he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there which had a withered hand. And they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he saith unto the man which had the withered hand, Stand forth. And he saith unto them, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. And when he had looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored, whole as the other. And the Pharisees went forth, and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him." As Jesus elsewhere puts it, in Mark 2:27, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." The apparent meaning, should we allow ourselves to extrapolate, being that what matters is not following the letter of religious rituals and rites, but acting to compassionately further human well-being. And then, for perhaps Jesus' most dramatic pronouncement on the subject, in Matthew 23:23, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." It's difficult to deny the wisdom of placing the rightful, compassionate treatment of human beings over adhering to seemingly arbitrary religious conventions. In so forcefully being a beacon for such a wisdom, Jesus did a great service to the world. Calling attention to the wrongness of hypocrisy. As echoed in the above verse, where Jesus declares, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," a key moral theme emerging from Jesus' teachings is opposition to hypocrisy. In Matthew 7:5, to take another instance, Jesus offers the following counsel: "Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye." It seems that according to Jesus, one's most important moral project lies in bettering oneself rather than bettering others. I find this to be an insightful teaching, not least because only one who has first sufficiently bettered herself is likely to be in a position to help others better themselves. Failing to pay heed to this lesson will more likely result in being an intrusively unhelpful moral busybody than in genuinely aiding anyone to develop themselves. Perhaps the most famous story illustrating Jesus' opposition to hypocrisy comes from John 8, 1-11. Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him. And he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he had heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself, and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself, and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. As this story nicely exemplifies, a world in which people turn away from hypocrisy, as did those who refused to stone the woman, is in many ways a world of greater understanding and compassion. Respect for children. In his ministry, Jesus shows great respect, even reverence, for children. In Matthew 18, 1-4, for instance, we find this anecdote. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted, and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. When Jesus speaks of how we should humble ourselves as this little child, I interpret him as referring to children's good-natured curiosity, openness of spirit, and lack of status-seeking, qualities that surely are, in fact, good to emulate. It speaks well of Jesus that he sees children not simply as small, incomplete beings relative to adults, but as beings who are whole and worth admiring in their own right. I believe that the world today would be better if people showed a similar respect for children, such as through giving children a greater role in using their natural curiosity to direct their education. Acknowledging that even those who act wrongly retain moral worth. In one of his most iconic passages, Matthew 5:44, Jesus declares, But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. To me, such a commandment reflects an understanding that the moral worth of an individual transcends whatever actions he may be doing at a given moment. If you look back to your own worst moments, probably you will feel that it would have been a mistake for an observer, or even your victim, to conclude that you yourself were a worthless person. Even in your lowest moment, you did not cease to have value, to be someone in many ways worth appreciating and treating well. So it is with people more generally. This love the sinner, hate the sin viewpoint, together with Jesus' advocacy of making peace and of offering forgiveness, contribute a good deal of humaneness to Jesus' moral teaching. Separation of church and state. Matthew 22:15-21 tells of the following encounter between Jesus and the Pharisees. Then went the Pharisees, and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth, neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar, or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness, and said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Shew me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. This last line from Jesus has often been interpreted as favoring a certain separation between religion and the state. Fulfill your spiritual duties, the thought goes, but see to it that you also fulfill your civic duties to the government. Neither set of duties, it seems, is to be subsumed under the other. Venturing a bit further, we might say that the affairs of the state are to be handled by the government, whereas the affairs of religion are to be handled by the individual, or perhaps individuals voluntarily banding together in the form of the church. Insofar as Jesus is in fact proposing the standardly interpreted separation of church and state here, I find this to be among his finest moral teachings. For such a matter of private conscience, as what one's religious beliefs and practices are to be, one should face no pressure or requirements from the state. Instead, it is to be decided on a more individual level, with the sole condition, of course, being that one's religious practices not violate the rights of others. Jesus was right to have taken the path of separating church and state, rather than endorsing theocracy. Taking all these points together, Jesus' moral teaching indeed captures some important truths. Although, as I'll discuss in the next post in this series, other elements of his moral teaching are arguably more objectionable, it'd be a mistake for anyone, however staunchly non-Christian they might be, to find nothing in his teaching worth learning from. So again, that is part 1 of this series on the moral teachings of Jesus. Why don't we pause here for a bit, and I'd be curious to hear if people have any thoughts that they'd like to share. Don't worry, I'm not going to stay here in the corner. I'm going to move back to my original location. So yeah, now that we've kind of read that initial post, if anybody has any thoughts or objections, can feel free to voice them. I do see there are already some comments in the chat, which I was not able to read very well during my reading time. But yeah, let's see what some of the people have said. Apus is Jesus aura farming. I mean, pretty much. Especially in the King James version of the Bible, which was the version I was reading from now. The language kind of gives a certain gravitas to Jesus' words that I think could sometimes be lacking in some of the other versions. Maybe it's just because the King James version is the oldest version of the Bible, at least that like most people come into contact with. And so the language sounds, a bit more archaic to our modern ears, but which lends it, a certain aura that really, I think, can come through quite nicely. Tia Fair, I swear a lot of people wouldn't understand that child bit if their life depended on it. How could a kid be better than me? I have a hedge fund. Also, heaven is fake. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are inclined to think of children as just incomplete adults and not beings who are sort of whole, complete beings in their own right and who have things to teach us, who have good qualities of their own. And I think that's really sad when somebody dismisses children in that way. Terraditto says, I think that the New Testament is pretty cool. In some ways, I suppose it is. Yeah, I mean, especially, like, for me, the strongest parts of the New Testament are those moral teachings of Jesus that I've just talked about. I think that he got a lot right in those teachings in particular. I'd also like to look at some of the earlier comments, though, because some of them, let's see, Tia Fair, an earlier comment here, unless you're still in your edgy atheist phase, it's so easy to see why the Bible has moved people the world over, reading those passages. It's not just weakness or stupidity, as some insist. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and this is one area in which my own thinking has evolved over time. Because during my edgy atheist phase, I was not really that willing to acknowledge that there were useful parts of religion, or that there were parts of Christianity in particular that were on the right track. I was sort of more in the vein of Richard Dawkins and so on, and Christopher Hitchens and other really staunchly anti-religious thinkers who were more kind of gave the vibe, gave the aura of like, hey, like this is all just garbage, like there's nothing useful in this, which I don't think anymore. I think that my view on religion is a bit friendlier now, even though I'm still an atheist. I do not have as anti-religious a view as I once did. yeah, I think that pretty much anybody who approaches this and it makes a real effort to look deeply into the text will find something here that is worth holding on to, something that is worth learning from. I can't really find anything to object to. Your interpretations have all been sound. Okay, good to know. Yeah, I think for this first post in this series, I mean, it does seem to me kind of hard to argue against most of these. I don't think most people, for example, would argue that adhering to the letter of ancient religious rites and customs matters more than showing compassion to actual people and healing people and so on. It's like all of that does seem to be on pretty firm ground. I think that the next two posts that I read in this series will maybe be a little more controversial, which maybe makes them more interesting. Or maybe makes the potential for, you know, a discussion of like, okay, is this the right view, or are these good objections? I think there's certainly some potential for interest there. On that note, I'm just going to go ahead and start reading the next two now, because this is really where I think it gets into some deeper philosophy for me, is the sort of question, okay, like, what parts of Jesus' moral teaching do I disagree with? And why? So right now I'm just going to go ahead and get post number 2 ready while you fell down the new atheist rabbit hole. Yeah, it happens to the best of us, what can I say? But yes, there definitely was a time when I did. And it's just so funny to me to think like, yeah, that's kind of how I got into philosophy. But I can't deny it. That is in fact sort of how it happened for me. All right. So here again is post number 2. Actually, I should go ahead and post this in the chat. So again, as before, if anybody wants to follow along, then you can do so at this link, the one that I just posted. This is part 2 of the series. The title is still How Good a Moral Teacher Was Jesus, but just part 2, examining the darker side of Jesus' moral teaching. In my previous post, I discussed some of the positive elements of Jesus' moral teaching, such as his opposition to hypocrisy and his acknowledgement that even those who act wrongly retain moral worth. Regardless of one's own religious views or lack thereof, these are moral insights worth appreciating. However, as I'll now argue, some of Jesus' other moral teachings are more objectionable. A false dichotomy between a godly life and a life of greed, vanity, and wickedness. One of the starkest themes in Jesus' moral teaching is that each of us faces a choice of what kind of life to live. On one hand, a life driven by pure, complete, self-abnegating devotion to God, and on the other, a life driven by rapacious materialism, preening self-obsession, and other manner of worldly sin. One moment where this theme emerges is the encounter between Jesus and the rich young man in Mark 10:17 through 23. And when he was gone forth into the way, there came one running, and kneeled to him, and asked him, Good master, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life? And Jesus said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. Thou knowest the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not kill. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Defraud not. Honor thy father and mother. And he answered and said unto him, Master, all these have I observed from my youth. Then Jesus, beholding him, loved him, and said unto him, One thing thou lackest. Go thy way, sell whatever thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. And come, take up the cross, and follow me. And he was sad at that saying, and went away grieved, for he had great possessions. And Jesus looked round about, and saith unto his disciples, How hardly shall they that have riches enter into the kingdom of God. Multiple points are worth noting about this passage. First, Jesus evidently has a most exacting standard for who counts as good, one so strict that it excludes all humans, even himself. To me, such a standard simply seems too strict. Many good people are out there. Some of them are among those whom I myself know, and whom I count myself fortunate to know. Perhaps you yourself can think of some such people in your life. True, the people I'm thinking of aren't perfect, but that doesn't make them fail to count as good. It's for this reason that I've never been able to take seriously the Christian standard that having committed wrong on even one occasion suffices to show someone to be a bad or sinful person at heart. Footnote, not that such a standard would explain why Jesus doesn't count even himself as good, given that he was allegedly sinless. In just about any other context, we'd find a parallel standard absurd. A grandmaster in chess can occasionally blunder a piece, yet remain a good, even brilliant chess player nevertheless. A symphony can include a minuscule, barely audible mistake from one of the players, but remain an excellent symphony tout compte fait. To think that the symphony must, in the wake of the trivial slip-up, fail to count as good would be to reveal so great a poverty of musical appreciation as to be not simply unfortunate, but outright bizarre. In a similar way, when it comes to one's goodness as a person, what matters is less any action taken in isolation than a more holistic consideration of how one's good and bad qualities and deeds stack up against one another. If, for a given person, the good qualities and deeds seem more significant than the bad ones, why should we not take that to show that she is indeed a good person on balance? Footnote, such considerations also, in my view, point to one of the problems with the doctrine of hell as a place of punishment for unbeliever sinfulness. However, I'll discuss hell in more depth in the next post, so let's set it aside for now. Returning to the above passage, we see that Jesus suggests that the rich young man will not inherit eternal life or have treasure in heaven, except by selling all his possessions, giving the proceeds to the poor, and abandoning whatever life projects he had hitherto been involved in, replacing them with the new project of being one of Christ's devout followers. Such an extreme call to self-denial is, of course, widely recognized as one of the more radical elements of Jesus' teaching. However, in this call to a life of ascetic religious devotion, it seems to me that Jesus too quickly and uniformly denigrates other ways of finding meaning. For example, let's imagine that the rich young man, in view of giving away all his possessions and following Jesus, decided to become a teacher, perhaps giving away some or even most of his wealth along the way, but nevertheless keeping enough to live, teach, and raise a family in the same place. Were he to follow such a path, particularly if we also imagine that he were to do this well, becoming the kind of teacher who cares deeply about his students and makes a genuine difference in their lives, why would this not be good enough as a path for his life? And if indeed God would condemn the man for choosing such a life, then why should Jesus endorse such a judgment, rather than simply concluding that God's ethical judgments are themselves sadly mistaken? If there's any doubt about how stringent Jesus thinks the standard is for counting as one of his followers, he clears it away in Luke 14:26. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Presumably, Jesus' meaning here is more metaphorical than literal. To be charitable, we might read his statement as meaning something like this: if you're truly to count as one of my disciples, then your love for me must be so great that even your love for your own family and for yourself must appear as hate by comparison, even though it should not, of course, literally be hate. That is the most charitable reading of his statement that I, at least, can muster. And yet, if that truly is what Jesus meant here, then it is a teaching that I still find insidious, particularly in the way it sets up love as a competitive matter, or something that derives its sense of worth from comparisons. To view love in such a way cheapens it. Love for one person, understood in a mature way, is not threatened by love for someone in addition. The greatness of one's love for someone can, and ultimately should, be understood on its own terms, rather than requiring some other, presumed lesser love to look down on. How much more beautiful, life-affirming, and wise a message it would have been had Jesus instead declared, "Your love for your father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and your own life also, threaten me not. May your love for them ever deepen as you grow in your love for me, and may your love for me ever deepen as you grow in your love for them." Summing up the kind of devotion Jesus asks of us, Christian ethicist David Gushee notes, God wants people to give their whole, full, complete, true, pure hearts, selves, souls, and lives to him. This is way beyond rules and obedience. It's devotion, it's submission, it's love. However, what if you fall short of this standard? What if, say, you're one of those wayward souls whose love for his family is just too strong to look like hate when compared to his devotion to God? At just about every step of his ministry, Jesus makes clear his disdain for normal, non-religious priorities and pursuits. He states, for example, that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God. Luke 16:15. In Mark 8:38, Jesus refers scornfully to this adulterous and sinful generation around him. At one point, Jesus tells one of his apostles, Peter, "Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." The dichotomy Jesus emphasizes between that which is of God, the good, and that which is of humanity, the bad, never lets up its strictness. As he puts it in one of his classic pronouncements in Matthew 6:24, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon," that is, riches or wealth. Strangely absent from Jesus' teaching is any serious engagement with what it might mean to serve a different master, to have a different focus in life, such as love for family, the pursuit of wisdom, or the creation of beauty. For Jesus, it appears that the only two life paths are, on one hand, the path of God, and on the other, the path of greed, vanity, and sin. Such a simplistic binarism fails to even begin to capture the vast range of worthwhile ways of living a life. To take just one example, imagine someone who lives a quiet life focused on the twin endeavors of raising a family and creating beautiful art. We might imagine further that she sees neither of these as a religious endeavor, and more generally, has no religious beliefs herself. Lastly, if she succeeds in her aims, becoming, that is, a good mother to her children, a kind presence in her community, an artist whose work moves people's spirits, and so on, then what exactly is supposed to be so bad about such a life? I see no answer from the words of Jesus to this question. Just abyssal silence. The more aware we are of the range of worthwhile lives that don't center on religious pursuits, the more bizarre appears Jesus' obsession with sin and with people's supposed need to be saved from their sinfulness. Jesus would have had a more compelling moral vision if he had been better attuned to the more positive aspects of human nature and to how one can live a meaningful life in ways that center on things other than God. Unclarity. In response to some of the points above and below, one might charge that I've simply misunderstood Jesus' words. Perhaps I have. Insofar, however, as that is indeed the case, there seems to me to be a different problem with Jesus' moral teaching, namely that he often doesn't make his meaning all that clear. Since part of being a good moral teacher is to make one's moral teachings understandable, any unclarity in Jesus' moral teachings detracts to that extent from his quality as a moral teacher. Examples of unclarity in Jesus' moral teaching generally follow a pattern. Jesus makes a claim that, read literally, sounds highly implausible or bizarre, which then invites one to attempt a more metaphorical reading, but with a consequent uncertainty of just how the metaphor is supposed to play out, as Jesus often doesn't explain it. For instance, in John 12:25, Jesus states, "He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal." If read literally, such a claim would seem to counsel ingratitude for all the things we might have thought one ought to be grateful for, such as good friends, family, and health. Ingratitude for such things, after all, would appear to be part of the package of hating one's life. Perhaps then, for the sake of being charitable, we should read the claim metaphorically. But just how metaphorically, and in what way? Does one who loves one's earthly life, quote, lose it in the sense of going to hell, going out of existence, or going through loss in some other sense? Is it a forbidden loving of one's life if one loves not so much one's continued existence per se, but certain things around one, such as family, friends, animals, art, and so on? What if one finds great enjoyment and fulfillment in one's religious activities? Does that count as a forbidden loving of one's life? Or, since the activities are centered on religion, does that make loving them okay? Such questions aren't mere nitpicks. It's easy to imagine them being the subject of genuine concern from someone with a thirst for understanding Jesus' moral teaching. And yet, by and large, Jesus refrains from giving extended, in-depth explanations or clarifications of his claims. For example, contrasting his intended meaning with superficially similar but substantively different readings, preferring instead to speak more aphoristically, a way that lends itself to confusion and conflicting interpretations. Additional examples are not difficult to find. For now, I'll consider just 3. As we saw above, in Luke 16:15, Jesus declares that that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God. He doesn't specify, though, what he has in mind by that which is highly esteemed among men. Does it refer to all things esteemed by people? Most things? Some things? If not all things, then which things? As we also saw above, in Luke 14:26, Jesus says, "If any man come to me, and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." Presumably, Jesus is not in fact counseling hating your own family and self. But then what is he counseling? Earlier I put forth the most charitable interpretation I could, but nevertheless suggested that it leaves Jesus' claim open to a challenging critique, which in turn makes salient the question of whether there are other interpretations. Gushy, for his part, interprets Jesus' words here as follows: "No human being or human community deserves ultimate allegiance, not even blood relatives." Suppose for a moment that that interpretation is the right one. If that is indeed what Jesus means, then why is it not what he says? If one's message has to be so redescribed from something that, on initial literal reading, sounds cultish and hateful, by others who are at pains to interpret one as charitably as possible, then one is already, to that extent, falling short as a moral teacher. In Matthew 7, 1-2, Jesus states, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." Presumably, Jesus doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever judge anything, that you shouldn't ever judge any action as wrong, any policy as ill-advised, any belief as irrational, and so on. So what might he mean instead? Here again, Gushi, seeking a charitable interpretation, proposes this. Even while we must make human moral judgments, as parents, teachers, governors, judges, citizens, church members, fellow humans, we must do so in a spirit of generosity, mercy, and humility, always remembering that moral scrutiny begins with ourselves and that the ultimate judgment on a human life belongs to God alone. If that's what Jesus in fact means, then why not simply put it that way? Or at least follow the aphorism with such a statement. That way would be much clearer. The persistent inattention to clarity in Jesus' words is attested to by the wide-ranging exegetical disagreements across the myriad Christian denominations. Disagreements, for instance, on the nature of the Eucharist, whether it's literally Christ's flesh and blood or only a symbol thereof, on the structure of authority in the Church, whether it's to be centralized in the manner of a papacy, as in the Catholic Church, and on whether those who are saved were predestined as such by God. When there's this much disagreement about how to interpret Jesus' teachings, surely that's a sign that the teachings could have been put more clearly. At one point, the issue of unclarity comes up explicitly in the Gospels, though what Jesus says about it strikes me as bizarre. And when he was alone, they that were about him with the 12 asked of him the parable of the sower. And he said unto them, Unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. But unto them that are without, all these things are done in parables, that seeing they may see, and not perceive, and hearing they may hear, and not understand, lest at any time they should be converted, and their sins should be forgiven them. Here Jesus seems to be suggesting that he speaks in parables specifically because of their propensity to generate confusion and misunderstanding. The reason he gives is that if certain people understood his message, then they might, quote, be converted, and their sins should be forgiven them, which is apparently somehow supposed to be a bad thing? Here's a different, less bizarre defense one might give of the unclarity. Perhaps not having the meaning laid out for us in its entirety more readily impels us toward reflection. It's more thought-provoking to be spoken to in parables and aphorisms. That way, you get to tease out the meaning yourself, rather than being subjected to a long-winded ethical treatise, in which everything is spelled out for you. I don't, however, find this to be successful as a defense of Jesus' lack of clarity. How thought-provoking one's statements are should come from the thoughtfulness and insight of one's ideas themselves, not from couching the ideas in vague metaphors and unacknowledged hyperbole. For a teacher who brings forth genuine insights, clarity will be an aid, not a hindrance, to the capacity to elicit thought. There's ultimately something cheap, favoring of style over substance, in relying on unclear rhetoric to generate an impulse to reflection or a sense of profundity. Emphasis on blind faith over reason, inquiry, and evidence. Jesus' moral teaching seems to me to succumb to a certain anti-intellectualism. Part of this is that Jesus declines to embrace the philosophical ethos, an ethos of giving arguments for one's claims, responding to objections, carefully weighing different points of view, and so on. In lieu of these, Jesus appears more or less content simply to offer sweeping pronouncements. By itself, perhaps this isn't so drastic a flaw. Some would no doubt take this moment to remind me that not everyone is a philosopher, and that that's okay. But what steers Jesus more firmly into anti-intellectualism is the way he praises uncritical acceptance over following evidence. A key verse here is John 20:29, which recounts the following moment from after Jesus' resurrection. Jesus saith unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. Why, though, is it more blessed to believe without seeing? To put the question as candidly as possible, are Jesus' words not making a virtue of gullibility and intellectual laziness? This anti-intellectualism matters to the quality of Jesus' moral teaching in a yet deeper way. For any subject, a great teacher is not one who merely gives others the right answers, but one who empowers others to think through the subject on their own. On this point, Socrates is the perennial role model. I find such empowerment to be sadly absent from Jesus' moral teaching. The spirit in which he offers his moral teaching is less, here are some tools you can use to help think your own way to important truths, and more, here are the answers for you to believe. Believe them or else. Some might object that Jesus' various reported miracles replace the need for arguments. After all, what ethical or religious argument could hope to match the power of walking on water, turning water into wine, or rising from the dead? It isn't so clear to me, though, that such miracles would obviate the need to give arguments for his moral claims, especially considering that his claims were meant to convince people far removed from his own place and time, people who never got the chance to see his miracles, but who might nevertheless have been convinced by ethical arguments, were they recorded in Scripture. Also, more importantly, performing miracles simply fails to give evidence that one's ethical claims are true. Having supernatural powers wouldn't do anything to show that one's a good moral teacher. After all, one's supernatural powers might, for all the audience knows, come from an evil source, a source whose intent on aiding one to spread a false message about morality. A final point about the significance of anti-intellectualism in Jesus' teaching bears mentioning. There to be something especially perverse, a sort of cosmic cruelty, in a God who gives us reason, making it in general our best, most reliable tool for figuring out the world, only to disparage it and have us set it aside when it comes to reaching the right answers to the most important, ultimate, eternal life or eternal death stakes matters of whether there's a God, and if so, of what God's nature is and what God wishes of us. Final section, emphasizing the wrong kind of reasons, prudential, fear-based reasons for following moral commands. On the question of why we should follow his moral commands, Jesus tends not to offer moral reasons, but prudential ones. More starkly, reasons grounded in fear, particularly the fear of going to hell. Here, for instance, is Matthew 5:22. But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. I agree with Jesus that one should not be angry without cause, and that one should likewise avoid speaking gratuitously harshly to others. But why is it important to follow these moral commands? One might have thought that the most germane reasons would have something to do with how everyone is worthy of respect, and that undue anger and harshness violate this respect. Or perhaps how speaking gratuitously harshly is apt to lead to hurt feelings. Reasons grounded in respect and well-being in such ways would, on a moral level, make a great deal of sense. Here, though, Jesus emphasizes a very different kind of reason, a squarely prudential one, avoiding divine judgment and hell. But is the reason for following moral commands like the above really just to avoid divine judgment and going to hell? Imagine for a moment that you found out that someone was treating you well simply for reasons like these, would you not be profoundly disappointed and indeed feel much greater distance or alienation in your relationship than before? The above is not the only example in which Jesus frames the reasons for following his moral commands in terms of danger, hell, divine judgment, and so on. Here are a few additional instances. But he that shall blaspheme against the Holy Ghost hath never forgiveness, but is in danger of eternal damnation. Mark 3:29. For if ye forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if ye forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Matthew 6:14-15. Footnote: an additional problem I have with this passage is that if, as the passage suggests, not forgiving others is bad, and it's good to forgive others for bad things they do, then wouldn't God be morally required to forgive us for not forgiving others? If God's forgiveness of us is contingent on whether we ourselves forgive, isn't that a way in which our own goodness or badness influences how good or bad God is? Should God's forgiveness really be conditional, any more conditional than any other aspect of his goodness? Judge not that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. And with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again. Matthew 7:1-2. More generally, Jesus tends to frame his moral commands not in terms of avoiding wrongness or pursuing the good, but avoiding sin. For instance, in Matthew 18:7, Common English Bible, Jesus declares how terrible it is for the world because of the things that cause people to trip and fall into sin. Such things have to happen, but how terrible it is for the person who causes those things to happen. I'd like to suggest that this very framing of moral commands, the framing in terms of sin, detracts from Jesus' quality as a moral teacher. Such framing invites thinking of ethics in terms of following, for all we know, arbitrary rules set by God, rather than in terms of more directly relevant moral factors. For example, harm, rights, respect, and so on. Factors that even God, if putting forth a set of moral commands worth following, would have to be responsive to. The prudential framing Jesus offers sometimes goes the other way, that is, focusing on rewards rather than punishments. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and thou shalt be blessed. For they cannot recompense thee. For thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. Matthew 6:6. Previous quotation was from Luke 14:13-14. In examples like these, too, there's a failure to speak in terms of the morally relevant features at play, and instead a sad reducing of moral motivation to bare prudence. In these latter cases, not that of avoiding the stick, but of pursuing the carrot. And then there's just a short concluding paragraph about previewing the next post, which I won't read just yet. So that is part 2 of this series of posts. Let's go back to just chatting. So thank you all for offering your thoughts. Again, I was able to sort of see people's comments in the chat as I was reading, but not to read them aloud or think about them too much. So I look forward to taking a look at them now and seeing kind of what people are saying. I'm just going to turn on a light in my room. This will just take a second. It got kind of dark in here with the night closing in. So here we go, turning on the light. Okay, that's better. yeah, so as last time, or as was the case last time, I would be interested in hearing whatever ideas people have in response, whether these are ideas in support or offering disagreements, potential ways my reasoning might have gone wrong. Let's take a look at some of the comments that have already been made. Let's see, it looks like the earliest one about that post was from Tia Fair. Could tidbits like these be more hyperbole than literal to inspire us to get as close to the goal as possible, even if failure is the likely outcome and he knows it? That's an interesting thought, Tia Fair. I do want to say that, like, it seems plausible to me that that could have been the intention. Like, if we're trying to look at the intention charitably, it does seem reasonable to think that, like, hey, maybe, like, putting the moral teachings in such strong language, hyperbolic language, might have had a motivational component. Or at least sort of part of the intention was to just, you know, motivate people to try extra hard, even though they might likely fail to be good in the ways, you know, Jesus hoped they would be good. So yeah, I can see how that was the intention, or that how that might have, you know, plausibly have been the intention. What I would still object to in that case, though, is, I guess an objection or worry I would still have is that even though that intention might be good, I think it does, or putting forth such hyperbolic language without having, you know, subsequent explanations or clarifications, I think one drawback of that approach is that, like, some people are going to take it literally. Or at the very least, some people, or many people, will wonder, just like, how literally should we take this? Or how exactly is this to be interpreted? And this might sound naive, and I will admit I don't know if I have a fully worked out proposal for how this could work, but I would like to think it's possible to put forth one's moral teachings in a way that motivates people to follow them without having it be left unclear just what the teachings are, or without having it be just, you know, unacknowledged hyperbole and just leaving it at that. I like to think that it's possible for it to be perfectly clear what one teaches, but still to deliver it in such a rhetorically powerful way that people see the wisdom and the goodness and are left purely with the motivation to follow the teachings and not with questions about just what the teachings are. And I think, just to state it very candidly, very forthrightly, I think if Jesus were the ideal moral teacher, I think that he would have found a way to make that possible for his teachings. See, Taradito says, I can read the hate for parents and such refers to abandoning the family and the good path being God instead of mammon as an abandonment of possession, as religion should be utmost priority. Yeah, I mean, it does seem fair to me to say that that's something Jesus thought, that religion should be the first priority. At least it would be hard to square any teaching to the contrary with what he says in that verse. And that to me is just, I guess, part of what I find implausible about his teachings, at least on this subject, is, should religion really be the first priority for everyone? Like, to such an extent that, like, as he sort of counseled the rich young man, like, give all your possessions to the poor and follow me. Yeah, my worry there would be that, like, doesn't that just too readily denigrate other ways of finding meaning? Like, I'm open to the thought that maybe for some people, a life spent, a life dedicated primarily to religious pursuits can be for them the most meaningful life. But it does seem to me difficult to think that that's the case for everyone. Yeah, I just cannot accept that is the case for everyone. Let's see, TFAO says, maybe they were meant for ancient society and seem incompatible with their more pro-individualist values today. Not a historian, so could be wrong on this. I'm just trying to think of the best way to engage with this. So, okay, on one hand, I think, yeah, it sounds like we agree. Well, first of all, yeah, I'm not a historian either, so I will offer any comment I have in a very tentative spirit. But it does seem absolutely right to me to say that society at the time Jesus was living had very different values, at least in some ways, from society today, or society, you know, in developed countries today. And in a way, Jesus was maybe speaking to those values or reflecting those values in certain ways. So that seems right. When it comes to the question, though, of like how good a moral teacher Jesus was, to me, one of the hallmarks of being a good moral teacher is having a certain timelessness in one's moral teachings. Like when we can look back at someone who was a moral teacher and think, you know, hey, this person went against what their society valued, and they were right for it. Like they had a truer moral view than the society around them had. To me, that is one of the greatest marks of someone who was a genuinely good moral teacher. And so, not that you were saying this, TFR, but if somebody were to say, well, look, doesn't Jesus' teaching just have to be kind of understood or evaluated, rather, relative to the moral teachings of his time, or the moral values of society at his time? I would say no. I think that how good a moral teacher someone is determined by how well their teaching aligns with objective morality. How well with morality, you know, it goes independently of like what a particular society happens to value. I haven't been agreeing with or defending Jesus' choices, by the way, just trying to brainstorm explanations. I see. Yeah, and I think that's absolutely a valuable thing to be doing. I think anytime we're looking at what a figure or a thinker has put forth, especially if it's someone that we're disagreeing with, it is always useful to be thinking like, okay, what are explanations for like why they might think this? Or, you know, what are things that, like, even if we don't feel the force of them, like what are things that maybe other people might put forth on their behalf? Yeah, I do absolutely see the value in that. They were trying to conserve ink while transcribing his words, obviously. Does the Bible need to be longer? So, yeah, like, how did I miss this one? Yeah, how did I not think of that? Actually, so the one thing about this that I like is it does, I think, helpfully call our attention to the fact that there were certain obstacles in Jesus' time to, you know, disseminating one's message that we do not face today. It would not have been as easy for, you know, Jesus to, let's say, write a blog or put forth, you know, a live stream or anything like that. Although maybe with like his supernatural powers, you know, he could have, but, you know, barring that, setting that aside. So yeah, like reproducing books at the time, reproducing writings would have been much more difficult than it is today. So that seems fair. I mean, I think that like if I were encountering somebody who put this forth to me as sort of a defense of why there isn't more clarification of his teachings in the Bible, then, well, I guess one point I would make is something that your comment kind of touches on near the end, which is like the Bible is already quite long, and for some of these teachings, I don't think it would take that much extra space to clarify them. Or even if the clarification doesn't reach like maximal clarification, like it might not be 100% clear. It might just take like a few sentences or a paragraph here and there to bring it up to, like, let's say like 95% clarity. And so that could be like a huge improvement in its own right. and this might sound a little sacrilegious, but I feel like if we're thinking about that kind of addition to the Bible, like even if we were to stipulate, which we wouldn't have to, but like if we were to stipulate like the Bible had to remain the same length, like surely there were other parts of it that could be cut out to make room for the clarification of Jesus' teachings. Like it seems like that would be the most important priority, is like focusing on, okay, how do we make these very contested, very difficult teachings of Jesus clearer? Like it seems like that is more important than, for example, let's see, what would be a good example? Well, like the book of Acts, for example. Okay, like the subsequent Acts of the Apostles. Not that like I have anything against Acts or it's a bad book, but like even if we were to like replace that entire book with just, or some of like Paul's letters to the church, some of his early letters to the church, like some of that could be taken out. Lots of the Old Testament could be taken out. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I feel like we could just like swipe all that aside and just, you know, make a little more room for Jesus' moral teachings. I'd be up for that. No, the ink thing was a joke. Okay. Good to know. If it wasn't a joke, that would be okay too. But thank you for clarifying what you had in mind by that. Terry says the Bible director's cut. I mean, that's basically what this is, what we're imagining here. More seriously, it's possible they overestimated our ability to decipher the intended meaning from such parsimony of words. Yeah, it could be. Maybe they thought, like, oh yeah, people will understand the meaning of this, and maybe from their vantage point, it might have been, you know, difficult to anticipate the extreme extent to which there would be disagreement about the interpretation. My only, I guess, reservation about that is there is that one passage where Jesus seems to kind of lean into the unclarity, kind of like acknowledge that, like, hey, speaking in parables like this is going to leave people confused, and that's a good thing. Like, that's why I speak in parables, so that they will hear but not understand, or seeing but not perceive. And to me, like, that seems like a really difficult verse for Christians to make sense of. Like, if I were a Christian, I think I would have a great deal of trouble incorporating that verse into the rest of my worldview about Jesus. So at the very least, in that verse, Jesus seems like not only nonchalant about the lack of clarity, but like actively aiming for the lack of clarity. And that's something that I just find very difficult to reconcile with the thought that he was an ideal moral teacher. I think that an ideal moral teacher would be one who was much more concerned about making the content of their ideas clear to all who are listening. Disagree with the writer's suggestion about miracles. There's reason to think Jesus wanted us to follow him for intrinsic reasons, not just because he was hippie Superman. Okay, I probably could have been clearer on this myself, but I did not want to come across as suggesting that Jesus' own reasons for wanting people to follow him were just that, like, he did miracles, or that, like, he wanted the miracles alone to convince them. My thought in that section was just like, hey, here's a possible defense that some people might give for why Jesus did not put forth arguments in favor of his views, or like why he did not sort of spend more time clarifying what he thought, is like he already had these miracles, and like surely that was that was more effective than any argument one might give for why he had the true views. And I was just sort of anticipating that as like a possible objection, and then giving a response, which is that the miracles alone don't really show the truth of the view. But yeah, I agree that that's, if one were to give that defense of Jesus' lack of arguments, then that would be purely one who's like imagining sort of a defense on Jesus' behalf, rather than going from anything Jesus himself says. See, Teraditos, it sounds like Jesus cannot find a good enough reason to make the rich give up their ways. other than threatening or metaphysical rewards. Yeah, I mean, that way of putting it is, I think, very direct, and like that's what one way you could put the challenge to Jesus is if we were sort of confronting him, or if one were confronting him in his time, one could say, look, does the teaching, if we're trying to sort of get people to a state of maximum moral insight, should we really be putting the teaching in such prudential terms, like some would even say like such fear-mongering terms of, you know, going to hell and so on, rather than just like, hey, this is the right thing to do. And I do think that for somebody who wants people to understand the right thing to do and why certain things are the right thing to do, couching one's language in such a fear-mongering way, I think goes against that, is counterproductive to that aim. Let's see, hard to reconcile. The last two sections could be that intellectualism can lead to hubris, such that Jesus would rather appeal to our pathos. So I'm just going to take a second to think about this one. Again, I know TF Aaron saying that you're not, because in the light of your earlier comment, or your later comment, I should say, you said, yeah, you haven't been agreeing or defending Jesus' choices, just trying to brainstorm explanations. Yeah, if somebody were to put that forth as a possible explanation or possible defense, then I guess I would say to that person that we have to be careful about like what we have in mind by hubris. Like, does hubris just mean thinking that people can figure things out through arguments, or like be persuaded through arguments? Because it seems to me like that's all that would be required for Jesus to have put forth more arguments, is sort of a faith that people would be moved by arguments, would be moved by an appeal to their reason. And I don't really see how there would be hubris in that, or I don't see how there would be hubris in people's being moved by reason, or people having the thought that, like, hey, I can figure out things about ethics through reason, or I can figure out things about how I should live through reason. I think there would be a certain hubris, perhaps, in thinking we can maybe arrive at certainty, or maybe that we can figure out everything through reason. Like, maybe there will always be some things we can't know, and that's just something that, like, as part of our proper epistemic humility, we should, you know, keep in mind. Like, and that's fine. But I would say that in the case of Jesus' teachings, and like for any teacher who's trying to just sort of get at the most basic, most fundamental truths of morality, I think having some faith that arguments could justify certain beliefs about like the basic truths of how we should live, to me it doesn't seem like hubris to think that that's the case. So that would be my main question to somebody who is putting forth that as an explanation, is like, why think that that is hubris? Or even if there is a certain hubris involved, then might that be less bad than being unclear about like what the teachings are? Yeah, that's another thing I would say there, is that, like, to me, the hubris actually, insofar as there is any hubris, or were any hubris, to me that would seem less bad than just outright confusion about like how we're to interpret the teachings, or what the reasons are for, you know, following these moral commands. Pterodito says, a thing I question though, Jesus is quite scalding about sin, but doesn't say he's free of sin. Isn't failure to be sinless, but still trying all to not do sin and to be cautious a big idea? Yeah, this is one, it kind of gets into the debate, at least for me, like what it calls to mind is the debate about whether Jesus ever claimed to be God. Because certainly the Christian view is that he did, of course, but I know that there are serious reasons that some have put forth, like Alex O'Connor is someone who's done some work on this and put forth some arguments on this, that Jesus did not in fact claim to be God, or that when we look at the Bible critically, that we see the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that in those gospels it's a lot less clear whether Jesus claimed to be God. And like in John, Jesus claimed to be God seems more present, but John also seems less historical for various reasons than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there's room to question whether Jesus ever claimed to be God, and along with that, like room to question whether, or like to what extent he really claimed to be free of sin. To my mind, the passage where he says like no one is good, like only God is good, where he kind of excludes even himself from being considered as good, I guess I could see how one might use that verse to support the claim that Jesus like doesn't claim to be free of sin. So if one were making that argument, I would at least understand where that's coming from. Isn't it failure to be sinless but still trying all to not do sin and be cautious a big idea? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding the spirit in which the comment is written, so I might be misinterpreting it. And if I am, you can tell me. But yeah, I mean, I guess I can see how, like, even if one were to say, okay, maybe Jesus wasn't sinless, then yeah, I don't think, like, I think that would be compatible with the view that Jesus was a great moral teacher. Because one could say, well, look, like, just consider like any regular person today, like any sinner today might still have like lots of insights about morality. Like, just because somebody occasionally acts wrongly doesn't mean that they don't have useful things to teach. Like, maybe the same thing could be true or could have been true of Jesus. So yeah, if that's the thought, then I agree that's a possibility worth keeping in mind. Stabby stabs. I don't want to always bring up Nietzsche, but when it comes to morality or mortality in a Christian sense, I guess maybe that was intended to be morality, he was one of the harshest critics. Slave morality was an interesting way to look at Christian ethics. Yeah, true. Definitely fair to say that Nietzsche was among Christianity's harshest critics. And one thing I really respect about him is the way that he's always willing to be so forthright in his writings. Like, there's a real sense in his writings that he doesn't hold anything back. Like, you can feel the passion, can feel the emotion. And that's something that I wish was a part of more philosophy or philosophical writing, is the way that Nietzsche really brought that out. So yeah, certainly he did not have a positive view of Christian ethics. He thought that it inverted the sort of natural relation between strong and weak and sort of made a virtue of weakness. And yeah, he was not a big fan. Not a big fan of that kind of view. About the timeless thing, is there any moral teacher more influential and timeless? We agreed earlier he was pretty timeless. Maybe there's a ceiling to how relevant one can stay after 2,000 years. So yeah, for this, I would say, like, yeah, full agreement that some aspects of Jesus' moral teaching are timeless, like his respect for children and, his opposition to hypocrisy. What I would say is that other aspects of his moral teaching, like the ones just described, fail to pass the test of time. And so I guess with his timelessness, I would say it's a mixed bag. Like, in some ways he was timeless, in other ways he wasn't. But for the thought, maybe there's a ceiling to how relevant one can stay after 2,000 years. I'm not sure. I mean, I think, like, realistically, it's going to be very difficult for all of one's moral teachings to pass the test of time, like, over a long-term time scale. Like, maybe it's just almost, superhumanly difficult to get everything right about morality and not ever have, subsequent generations realize, like, oh, this person was wrong about X, Y, and Z topics. So, like, if the thought here is, hey, maybe Jesus did, like, you know, as like a reasonably good job, or like as good a job like as could be expected, like of a human for the time. Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, I could maybe see myself coming around to that point of view, and it would essentially be like a way of saying, like, yeah, he wasn't an ideal moral teacher, but like, come on, like no one no one can be an ideal moral teacher, like someone who gets everything right. And yeah, I mean, that's maybe a fair point. I guess I would say it looks like Christians probably would not be willing to go that way, because I think on their view Jesus is an ideal moral teacher. But like, if we're not committed to the Christian view of it, we could just say, like, yeah, Jesus got some things right, some things wrong. Like overall, maybe we could even say like he did a pretty good job. Maybe it would be unrealistic to expect that he could have done a better job. Or at least that, yeah, that's what some would say. I mean, for my part, I don't really see how it's that unrealistic to think he could have done a bit more in terms of like giving arguments for his views, or a bit more in terms of clarifying certain parables and teachings that he gave. Like, I think if he were to do that, that would have helped his teachings stay relevant and pass the test of time, or at least it could have, without like expecting too much extra of him. That's just my own intuitive sense, if I want to speak very candidly about it. But the point that like maybe we can't expect perfection is fairly taken. The Bible was assembled a long time after the death of Jesus, and the pieces that make it up were written decades after his death. We don't know how much of the Bible were his words. Likewise, a very fair point that here, in sort of advancing these critiques, I can only go on the picture of Jesus that's presented in the Bible. But yeah, we should absolutely keep in mind that might not be like the actual Jesus. That the real historical Jesus might have been different in various ways from what was recorded. And some of those ways might have been better, you know, than what was recorded in the Bible. Aristotle's golden mean could be argued to be timeless, and some Eastern teachings are still extremely influential centuries later. Not as well versed in those. Yeah, I mean, when I think about timelessness, like, yeah, I think it is a good thing to bring in like other thinkers and other moral teachers, and to think like, okay, how does Jesus stack up to them? And maybe this is just because I'm a philosopher, but like with Socrates in particular, I think his example is especially timeless, which gives me sort of a hope, or makes me think that it's possible that even, you know, thousands of years later, maybe one's teachings can still be, on the whole, you know, extremely relevant and can pass the test of time with flying colors. Well, Confucius was massively influential in many highly populous Asian countries, but he was very problematic. I assume when we say good, we mean not just effective, but righteous. Yeah, at least that's the way I'm using it here. So somebody who sort of got the right view about objective morality, like if there is such a thing as objective morality, somebody who sort of hit on the major truths about it. Thought Jesus foresaw that most modern Americans wouldn't read the Bible anyway, so he stopped trying after a while. Hey, understandable, Jesus, if that's the case. I know it's demoralizing to think like you're putting forth all this writing, all these teachings, and, you know, people aren't listening. So, you know, I can't fault you for that. Well, why don't we look at the final post in this series? I've been enjoying reading everyone's comments, but I do want to look at kind of the last set of critiques that I have. And like the previous post, this one will advance kind of 4 primary criticisms. These are in a bit of a different vein from the previous one, though some of them link up in certain ways. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear what people think about this second set for a second set of criticisms for part 3. So again, the title of this one, kind of like previous versions in the series, is How Good a Moral Teacher Was Jesus, but this is part 3. Subtitled The Finale. In my previous post, I argued that while some of Jesus' moral teachings are certainly laudable, in other ways his moral teachings fall short. In particular, they put forth a false dichotomy between a godly life and a wicked one. They're often unclear, they favor blind faith over reason and evidence, and they emphasize the wrong kind of reason, namely prudential reasons, for acting morally. While these problems are significant, they do not exhaust the flaws with Jesus' ethics. In this post, the final entry of the series, I'll examine what I believe to be a further set of problems afflicting his moral teaching. Hell. Quote, "There is one very serious defect, to my mind, in Christ's moral character, and that is that he believed in hell. I do not myself feel that any person who is really profoundly humane can believe in everlasting punishment." Bertrand Russell. Although some have challenged whether the doctrine of an eternal hell is in fact biblical, Jesus' words, at least at first glance, certainly suggest a belief in hell as a place of suffering without end. He refers, for instance, to the danger of eternal damnation, Mark 3:29, and everlasting fire, in Matthew 18:8. In Matthew 7:21, Jesus declares, "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven," thereby suggesting, in the context of the rest of his statements, hell for the rest. Similarly, in Matthew 7:14, Jesus states that strait is the gate, and narrow is the way, which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. In Matthew 13:40-42, meanwhile, we find this: "As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." And here, for good measure, is Luke 16:19-26, in which Jesus offers the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, a parable whose ending suggests that those in hell cannot cross into heaven. "There was a certain rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died, and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died, and was buried. And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham far off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivedst thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. Insofar as Jesus' words do in fact indicate that he endorses the doctrine of hell in the way that they at least initially seem to, and which many or most believers have taken them to, that is a heavy stain on his moral teaching. I find it impossible to overstate the barbarity of any afterlife system that would inflict such a degree of suffering. A degree of suffering that, in being maximally intense, maximally long, that is forever, and extending to untold numbers of people, would be infinitely worse than all the combined suffering that's ever taken place on Earth. But abstract formulations of the inhumanity at issue can only take us so far. For a more vivid, but still necessarily incomplete glimpse of its true scale, I ask any believer in the doctrine of hell to consider the following scenario. Imagine that you one day find yourself in God's presence in the afterlife. Now take someone from your life whom you love and respect, but who is not themselves a believer, and imagine that you see them alongside you in the afterlife. However, unlike you, they are lying bound and helpless. Suddenly, God places a freshly fired branding iron into your hands, and, with an assurance to you that this will be part of his divine justice for this unbeliever, commands you to push the iron's red-hot end into your loved one's face. What thoughts would strike you in that moment? Would not every last fiber of your human decency be screaming into your mind that this is wrong? And consider now that what God would be asking you to inflict here would be merely a moment of an approximation of what in hell is supposedly inflicted forever. Footnote: there is, of course, a rough biblical analog to this thought experiment, namely the story of how God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac in Genesis 22. In the story, Abraham resolves to obey God's command, but God stops Abraham at the last possible moment, just as he's about to plunge the knife. God then profusely blesses Abraham for being so obedient. Through this story, we see how the Bible portrays it as something praiseworthy, the willingness to brutally murder one's own child, if commanded to do so by God. The above considerations are, in my view, enough to make hell the most morally indefensible doctrine that's ever been put forth. Nor do the problems stop there. A further problem with the doctrine of hell is the way it hinges the prospect of infinite suffering on whether one happens to have had the right religious beliefs. See, for example, John 3:16. While subjecting people to eternal torture is an unconscionable idea in its own right, there's something especially perverse about tying it to what religion someone happened to believe or disbelieve. There are, after all, various qualities about a person that intuitively matter a great deal more than which religion they adhere to. Qualities like being a loving person, making use of one's talents to better the world, and so on. Yet another problem with the doctrine of hell is the way it sets one's death as the deadline for belief in the right religion. Such a deadline, I've argued elsewhere, is arbitrary. Lastly, it seems to me that the doctrine of hell poses a glaring tension with Jesus' claims elsewhere about the importance of loving your enemies and of forgiving without end. Jesus would have done better to have embraced such principles more consistently and to have abandoned the whole notion of hell. The atonement. Oh, by the way, side note, sorry, I forgot to put the link in chat. There's the link in case anybody wants to follow along. The atonement. The central doctrine of Jesus' teachings, and of Christianity more broadly, is the atonement. According to this doctrine, humanity has, through its sinful, fallen state, separated itself from God, and is thus bound for hell. Bound for hell, that is, absent some divine intercession on humanity's behalf. Fortunately for humanity, precisely such a divine intercession has taken place, namely the life and death of Christ. When God took on a human form, lived a sinless life, and suffered and died as a sacrifice, so that any of us might be saved, if only we believe in Jesus' divinity and accept the sacrifice he made for us. This doctrine finds expression in familiar verses, such as John 3:16-18. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Jesus also refers to how the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many, a verse that calls to mind the way Jesus is often likened to a sacrificial lamb. Many theologians over the millennia have attempted to provide an account of the atonement. While I cannot review all their various theories here, arguably the most widely embraced understanding of the atonement is grounded in a notion of penal substitution. Through our sinfulness, we deserve to face the wrath of God. But Christ, in his sinlessness and his death on the cross, altruistically volunteers to have the punishment transferred to him, such that God's wrath against us is quelled, and we no longer have to face any punishment, provided that we accept the sacrifice. If indeed that, or something near enough, is how we are to understand the atonement, then I see multiple problems. One of them calls back to a point I made in the previous post, namely that Jesus' view of humanity is mired in an obsession with sin, an obsession that, in the present case, leads him to make inferences about punishment that are so radical as to be flat out bizarre. It's not simply that the doctrine of the atonement, understood in the manner described above, seems to presuppose retributivism, that is, the view that punishment for wrongdoing is something deserved, such that it's intrinsically good when those who do wrong are punished for doing so. Though this is itself, let us keep in mind, a non-obvious, controversial, philosophically weighty commitment for a belief system to have, and one often unacknowledged as such in discussions of Christianity. Worse than this, the problem I see with the atonement is that it's built on the most extreme, all dials cranked to 11 version of retributivism possible, a version which states that infinite punishment is the deserved response to anyone who does any wrong whatsoever, no matter how minor the wrong might seem, or how greatly it might appear to be outweighed by one's good qualities and actions across one's life. Were I coming across such a view for the first time, I'd assume that it was meant as a parody of retributivism, rather than being a view that is meant to be taken seriously. But let's set that criticism aside for a moment. Even if the maximally extreme version of retributivism described above is true, there remains the problem that the vicarious punishment at the core of the atonement is unjust. In any other context, we're inclined to recognize the injustice of penal substitution. For example, imagine a convicted murderer who's been sentenced to death. For present purposes, stipulate that this is the deserved punishment for his crimes. But now suppose that an innocent person volunteers to be subject to the death penalty in the murderer's place, such that the murderer gets to walk free. We rightly don't allow such a practice in our legal system, as that would be insane. It's unclear to me why the penal substitution posited by the atonement would be any less unjust. On the Christian view of the atonement, the right response to Jesus' teachings is to feel overwhelming gratitude for his sacrifice of himself for our sins. In view of the difficulties above, though, it seems to me that our reaction should be a different one, namely to judge that the very idea of a sacrificial lamb is morally grotesque. Unduly negative and restrictive views of sex and relationships. At a few points in his moral teachings, Jesus addresses sex and relationships, but his pronouncements on them strike me as unduly negative and restrictive. In Mark 10, 8 through 12, for example, Jesus offers what many have interpreted as a general injunction against divorce, along with the declaration that divorce followed by marriage to someone else is a form of adultery. And they twain shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And in the house his disciples asked him again of the same matter, and he saith unto them, Whosoever shall put away his wife, and marry another, committeth adultery against her. And if a woman shall put away her husband, and be married to another, she committeth adultery. Even committed Christians often seem to find these verses a source of embarrassment, and understandably so. If indeed it's a categorical opposition to divorce that Jesus is voicing, then the major problem is that divorce seems clearly justified in some cases, such as cases in which spouses are genuinely and firmly no longer happy together, to say nothing of cases involving abuse. Further, to touch on Jesus' second point above, it's simply unclear how marrying someone new after divorcing one's previous spouse could be adultery, given that one is no longer in a relationship with the first spouse. At this point, some might object that I'm looking at Jesus' teaching from a contemporary context, and that to fully understand his words, I should approach them from the context of his own time, a time when society was in many ways very different. For instance, in Jesus' day, it was vastly more difficult for a divorced woman to find a new husband than in today's world. An especially serious point when considering that the social status and economic well-being of women in such times depended more on having a husband than in developed countries today. Perhaps such points could make Jesus' apparent opposition to divorce more understandable, or even, with some further interpretive work, suggest that Jesus might have had a less negative view of divorce in today's world. While I lack sufficient knowledge of the relevant history and sociology for an extended discussion of this point, I can at least make one point in response. The more one's moral teachings must be contextualized in such a manner, as opposed to standing timelessly on their own, the less timeless a moral teacher one arguably is. And as timelessness is itself one of the marks of being a great moral teacher, the extent to which contextualization and reinterpretation are needed for one's moral teachings does, in the end, seem to bear on one's quality as a moral teacher. Let's now consider a different example of Jesus' teachings on sex and relationships. In Matthew 5, 27 through 28, Jesus states, Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. To begin, I'll concede that there is a sense of committing adultery in one's heart that seems wrong. Specifically, if one intends to commit adultery on a given occasion, but is simply and suddenly prevented by one's circumstances from carrying out this intention, then simply having had the intention would count as a betrayal of one's partner in its own right. Perhaps even a betrayal that's just as wrong as an act of adultery that actually gets carried out. However, it's not clear why merely looking lustfully or fantasizing about sex with a third party in a way that falls short of intending to commit any actual adultery would be so objectionable. To me, it seems no more objectionable than, say, daydreaming about pulling off a bank heist so that one has plenty of cash to have fun with, or about taking a joyride in a supercar. How silly it'd be to condemn such daydreams with pronouncements like, you've pulled off a bank heist in your heart, or you've driven recklessly in your heart. However wrong it'd be to do, or even simply intend to do such actions, there remains a crucial moral difference between intending to do something and merely fantasizing about doing it. I believe that in his excessive strictness when it comes to what kinds of sexual thoughts and fantasies people can have, Jesus falls into the trap of embracing, or at least suggesting, a puritanical view of sex as bad by default, or as something that can only be rendered permissible in limited spheres and under strict restrictions. A puritanical view of sex, particularly when the sexual feelings or interactions at issue are by all indications victimless, is a most regrettable flaw for a set of moral teachings to have. If you'll excuse me for a moment, I'm just going to drink a little bit of water. Missed opportunities. A final category of problems in Jesus' moral teaching has to do with things he didn't say. Important moral truths he could have put forth, but chose not to. Or at least did not do so in a way that went on to be reflected in the biblical record. At first glance, such a criticism might seem to be applying an overly exacting standard to Jesus as a moral teacher. Is the standard being implied here, for instance, that he was supposed to have expressed every important moral truth? Surely that would be a tall order. After all, there are many important moral truths out there. Here, however, I'm not assuming such a standard. Even though Jesus, in claiming to be the Son of God and a prophet for all humankind, arguably does invite himself to be judged by the highest of standards as a moral teacher. What I do wish to show is simply that there are some moral truths that are so important and so basic, moral truths whose clear, firm expression by Jesus and consequent acceptance by his followers would have made the subsequent history of the world go significantly better, that it seems like a glaring omission for Jesus not to have included them among his pronouncements. Following are at least some such moral truths that are missing from the biblical record of Jesus' teaching. In Jesus' words, we never find an explicit, unequivocal statement that slavery is a moral atrocity. Men and women are equally morally important, and no person should be denied any right simply on account of that person's sex. People of all races are equally morally important, and no person should be denied any right simply on account of that person's race. There's nothing wrong with being in an interracial relationship. There's nothing wrong with being in a gay relationship. Animals are not to be viewed simply as tools to be exploited for human ends. Animal suffering counts morally. Insofar as a course of action would cause suffering to an animal, that is a moral reason against it. Imagine for a moment how much of a difference it would have made, how much wrongness and suffering could have been prevented in the subsequent course of history if Jesus had taken a firmer stand on such matters by making statements like the above. In all this, what I'm imagining is that the relevant statements would be so explicit that they could be readily understood even by people far removed from Jesus' own context, without the need for endless volumes of contextualization and commentary, as all that introduces greater potential for unclarity, diverging interpretations, and ignorance. A moral teacher who was himself God would, being omniscient, have known moral truths like these. He would also have known the importance of communicating such truths unequivocally, and making sure that the record of his having communicated them is well preserved for after he's gone. But what we find in the Gospel's record of Jesus' moral teaching doesn't appear to reflect any such recognition. Conclusion. Taken together, these points cast a shadow on Jesus' moral teaching. One caveat, though, is that the biblical record of Jesus' life and teachings is, of course, incomplete. The final verse of John offers a poetic note on this. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Perhaps Jesus occasionally put forth better moral teachings that simply didn't go on to be recorded. Or perhaps what he did say ended up being in certain ways distorted in the Gospel's record. In offering the above critiques, I can only go on the picture of Jesus presented in the Bible. Still, the problems I've gestured at are an essential part of why I don't find Christianity, despite the evident goodness of most Christians I know, to be a morally compelling religion. Many non-Christians, when discussing moral reservations about Christianity, focus on the atrocities of the Old Testament. While those are, to my mind as well, a dark mark on Christianity, I hope to have shown in this series that the moral objections to Christianity remain pressing even when we bracket out the Old Testament and restrict our focus to the New, more specifically to the words of Jesus himself. Christianity holds that Jesus is the moral teacher par excellence, the greatest who ever lived, the greatest who ever could live. Yet given what strike me as grave flaws in his moral teaching, I cannot accept that. So how good a moral teacher ultimately is Jesus? Well, in this post and the previous, I focused on the negatives. There are also, as my first post in this series goes into, some important positive elements to his moral teaching, such as his respect for children and his favoring of compassion over arbitrary religious rituals and customs. Thus, while I believe that it's mistaken to consider Jesus a great moral teacher, I also feel that it'd be mistaken to consider him a terrible one. When it comes to being a moral teacher, Jesus is, in the end, a mixed bag. Arguably, his most human of qualities. So thank you again, everyone, for listening to that, for reading along with me. And now, just like last time, I am super curious. I have not really been reading the comments too much on this one, but yeah, let's see what people say. And also feel free to add any new ones if you would like to share any thoughts on what you just heard. Terraditto says, a bit funny to think Jesus saying divorce bad might be for equality reasons. Yeah, it is a little bit of an inversion from the way we normally think about a teaching like that. TFAirs, this part 3 covers the reasons I'm an atheist and not religious, despite liking some of Jesus' ideas. I see. I refuse to believe we are born indebted and chained by guilt, regardless of our life choices. Yeah, I do agree that for those who have that particular doctrine of original sin, that is one of the extremely implausible elements in that kind of religious belief. Terraditto, interesting read. Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is one of those topics that I enjoy thinking about. And one thing I'm thinking about now is, like, are there any other objections to Jesus' teachings that I have? I'm not sure if there are. I think those are certainly the major ones. So in this series of posts, I tried to sort of capture all of the real pressing points that, at least for me, have influenced why I don't find myself to be a Christian. Honestly, I think this trilogy has been the best writing you've read on stream so far. Really thorough and insightful. I'd like to cite it one day should I speak on the same topic. Oh, that means a lot, TFAir. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And of course, yeah, I mean, yeah, feel free to cite it whenever. I'm honored that you feel that way and are interested in citing it and, you know, speaking on the topic. Yeah, this isn't the only philosophy of religion piece that I've done on my blog, but it is the most major one, this trilogy. Might have more to say on it in the future, not about Jesus' moral teachings in particular, but more about just philosophy of religion in general. Like, one question that I find kind of interesting and that I've been thinking about lately is what Christians should say about the prospect of intelligent life being elsewhere in the universe. Like, whether God's plan, so to speak, the atonement and so on, whether all of that would apply to, like, an alien species that we encounter, or whether they should think like that there are intelligent alien species out there, or whether, like, on the Christian view, the most plausible thing to accept is just or the most compatible thing with their worldview would be to think that perhaps there aren't other intelligent alien species. Kind of interested in that question lately, so I might do some writing on that in the future. One thing I will say is that, and this is probably obvious from other things that I've said, but I'll just say it anyway. I absolutely do think that even, despite not being a Christian myself, I do think the Bible is very important to know, just both for our cultural heritage and just because these are important things to think about. And for me, like, there's also just a very important personal connection in that, like, it's how I sort of got into philosophy, or at least like one of the major ways I got into philosophy. And I know, like, I'm not the only one for whom that's the case. Like, I know Alex O'Connor is another, a much bigger YouTuber, of course, but someone who's kind of in the atheist space, someone who makes videos about philosophy of religion. And for him too, like, thinking about like all the new atheist stuff when that was first coming out was kind of how he got interested in philosophy. So I gather this is not exactly an uncommon way of entering philosophy, but it has been one that's really it means a lot to me when I look back on it, to think about, oh yeah, it was kind of cool how all these discussions led me to become interested in this. I think another way I got interested in philosophy was thinking about emotions and like wanting to understand what love is. So maybe I'll speak on that in future streams a bit more, or maybe read some writing on that. So I know earlier we had Jesus Christ himself in the chat. I don't know if he's still here, but if you're still here, Jesus, then just know that, again, I think there are certainly some things you got right. And if you want to push back on any of the points that I think you got wrong, feel free to. But in any case, yeah, honored to have had you here. Also, kind of related note, all of that is for those who like enjoy these blog posts and just enjoy philosophy in general. One thing that is worth considering is, if you're someone who like finds yourself having strong reactions, whether of agreement or disagreement or anything else, it might be worth considering starting your own blog. I sometimes kind of wish I had gotten into blogging more seriously kind of a bit earlier. It's a great way of sharing one's thoughts and sort of seeing, what other people think, continuing the discussion that way. So yeah, I don't know what my next post will be about. I still have some ideas that I'm thinking of. Might be on the question of like Christians and what they should think about extraterrestrials. Or maybe I'll choose something different. But anyway, I think that in a second I will be heading out and making some dinner. Yeah, I think dinner sounds good. I want to make sure I'm covering all of the comments though. Yeah, I don't think there were any that I didn't engage with. But thank you everyone for joining with me on this stream. I've really enjoyed reading this and thinking about this with you. So wherever you find yourself for the rest of this evening, I hope that it is an enjoyable evening for you. And also don't forget, tomorrow evening, I will be continuing my stream of Star Trek Resurgence. So this is the kind of choice-based Star Trek game, story-heavy Star Trek game. Because Star Trek is one of my favorite series, and I love it for its philosophical content. I understand it's been a little while since I did the last one, so people might have forgotten some of the story. That's okay if you have. I'll try to give a little recap at the start before I go into the actual gameplay again. So anyway, for those who are there, I will see you there. For those who will be elsewhere, I hope that life brings you a lot of happiness tomorrow, wherever it finds you. Yep, so thank you again, everybody. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.